In late 1943, the strategic center of gravity on the Eastern Front shifted to right bank Ukraine. The Red Army had forced multiple crossings of the Dnieper between September and November, liberated Kyiv on the 6th of November 1943, and created bridgeheads that threatened the rear of Army Group South. Stavka directed two neighboring operational groupings, the 1st Ukrainian Front under Nikolai Vatutin and the 2nd Ukrainian Front under Ivan Konev, to exploit these gains during the Dnieper-Carpathian campaign. Their combined intent was to break the German 8th Army and 1st Panzer Army along the middle Dnieper, separate them from Army Group A in the south, and push the front line toward the southern Bug and Dniester rivers. Soviet planning framed the area around the towns of Korsun, Zvenihorodka, and Shpola as a salient vulnerable to converging strikes from north and south. Army Group South, commanded by Erich von Manstein, entered the winter of 1943 to 1944 with reduced infantry strengths and a limited number of mobile formations. The German 8th Army, led by O. Wöhler, defended a forward-bent line west of Cherkasy that had been retained after elastic withdrawals in October-November. Two corps, 11th Army Corps under Wilhelm Stemmermann and 32nd Army Corps under Theodor Lieb, held the main arc of positions between the Rose and Hinilai-Tikich rivers, with multiple infantry divisions, reinforced by assault guns, divisional artillery, and local security units. Their mission was to delay and canalize Soviet pressure while maintaining a continuous front tied to the Dnieper crossings farther southeast. The line's geometry produced interior roads, but also exposed shoulders. The defense relied on village strongpoints, field fortifications, and frozen terrain that, for the moment, permitted cross-country movement. The operational logic behind the German deployment reflected competing requirements. High command directives prioritized holding economically important districts and the remaining east-west rail arteries that supplied the southern wing. Segments of the Znamianka-Smila-Kristinivka network and feeder lines toward Uman. Simultaneously, mobile reserves were thinly spread along a frontage extending from north of Kyiv to the lower Dnieper. 3rd Panzer Corps and 47th Panzer Corps were tasked as counterstroke instruments, but constant fire brigade commitments eroded their rest and refit cycles. Fuel deliveries had to traverse over stressed lines vulnerable to partisan disruption. Winter conditions increased consumption and reduced vehicle availability. Soviet intelligence summaries in December 1943 and early January 1944 assessed that German defenses west of Cherkasy lacked operational depth and depended on rapid panzer counterattacks to seal breaches. The 2nd Ukrainian Front concentrated the 53rd Army, 4th Guards Army, and 5th Guards Tank Army along axes south of the salient, with supporting roles for the 52nd Army and a cavalry mechanized group tasked to exploit toward Uman. The 1st Ukrainian Front prepared 40th Army and 27th Army for the northern pincer, with independent tank and mechanized corps positioned as breakthrough exploitation echelons. Artillery groupings were reinforced with Guards mortar brigades and heavy guns for counter-battery suppression. Stavka orders emphasized synchronized start times, rapid engineer bridging over minor rivers, and encirclement as the preferred method to avoid attritional assaults on village lines. Weather and terrain shaped both plans. January brought alternating thaws and freezes, then heavy snowfalls that drifted across open fields and clogged minor roads. The frozen surfaces enabled initial off-road movement for tracked vehicles, but complicated supply. Sled columns and horse transport supplemented truck columns where snow depth made wheeled traffic unreliable. River crossings, though iced, required engineer reconnaissance for load-bearing capacity. For the civilian population in the Cherkasy and Kirovohrad oblasts, already strained by requisitions, evacuations, and the destruction of 1943, the winter promised another cycle of dislocation, with front lines approaching settlements that had only recently seen the Germans fortify barn schools and mills into strongpoints. Operational decision-making on both sides reflected strategic pressures beyond the local map. For Berlin, the loss of right bank Ukraine would threaten the approach to Romania's oil fields and expose Army Group A's positions in the lower Dnieper and Crimea. For Moscow, destroying large German groupings west of the Dnieper would accelerate the collapse of the Southern Front and free resources for subsequent operations toward the Carpathians. Stavka's January timetable demanded simultaneous encirclement operations along multiple sectors, accepting logistical risk in return for operational surprise. German directives stressed hold-fast positions, combined with counterstrokes once Soviet spearheads extended beyond their artillery coverage. Command structures and communications set the framework for the coming decisions. On the German side, Army Group South's operations staff coordinated corps-level responses, with radio nets linking corps and divisional HQs to Luftwaffe close air support units when weather allowed. On the Soviet side, front HQs retained control of tank and mechanized corps intended for deep exploitation, while Army HQs coordinated combined arms break-in with attached tank brigades and engineer assault groups. Both sides deployed field railway detachments to restore track and maintain supply, but German units depended on fewer operational locomotives and faced more frequent interdictions. By mid-January 1944, reconnaissance confirmed Soviet force concentrations on both flanks of the Korsun Bend. German situation reports noted increased artillery registration fires and night movements opposite the 57th, 72nd, and other infantry divisions along the arc. Soviet front orders set H-hour for late January, with the northern and southern pincers to break in on separate axes, aiming to meet west of Korsun-Shevchenkovsky. The intended encirclement would enclose 2 German corps and associated support units inside a pocket approximately 40 by 30 kilometers, depending on the speed of exploitation. The preconditions for such an encirclement, salient geometry, thin mobile reserves, winter supply constraints, and synchronized Soviet groupings were now in place. This was the context in which subsequent choices would be made, whether to hold forward positions or pivot to a shortened line, how to allocate limited armored reserves between multiple threatened sectors, how quickly Soviet commanders could convert tactical breaches into operational encirclement under winter weather that might ground air support for both sides. With dispositions set and timetables fixed, the opening phase began as artillery groupings rolled forward and engineers marked the ice. Before dawn on the 24th of January 1944, both Soviet fronts opened with tightly timed artillery preparation. On the northern arc, 1st Ukrainian Front assigned 40th Army and 27th Army to breach the forward German line between the Rose and Hnilia-Tikich rivers. Assault battalions with engineer detachments moved on frozen fields toward villages that had been turned into strongpoints, with interlocking machine gun positions and pre-registered mortar zones. South of the salient, 2nd Ukrainian Front directed 53rd Army and 4th Guards Army to break through on axes converging northward, while operational exploitation was reserved for mechanized and tank formations positioned on lateral roads behind the infantry armies. Weather alternated between snowfall and low cloud, reducing visibility and constraining air support on both sides. Artillery and direct fire weapons set the tempo. The first 48 hours produced multiple narrow breaches rather than a uniform rupture. The northern attacking armies reported village-by-village fighting along lines east of Zvenihorodka and toward Shpola, with German infantry regiments withdrawing by bounds to secondary hedgehog positions, as local counterattacks probed the shoulders of Soviet penetrations. The German 11th and 32nd Army Corps attempted to preserve cohesion by trading ground for time, relying on the frozen landscape to maintain lateral movement between road hubs. Divisional signals nets emphasized short, controlled withdrawals to avoid encirclement at the company and battalion level. The Corps artillery pooled guns to impose fire on Soviet assembly areas when observation permitted. Soviet front headquarters sought to translate local cracks into an operational level encirclement. By late 25th January, 1st Ukrainian Front introduced mobile elements along the northern breakthrough sectors. Forward detachments of 6th Tank Army and attached mechanized brigades probed westward beyond the last prepared German trench lines toward road crosses near Lysyanka and the approaches to Zvenihorodka. On the southern pincer, 2nd Ukrainian Front prepared 5th Guards Tank Army for commitment as soon as infantry established reliable crossings over minor streams and cleared anti-tank obstacles around Talnay and Kristinivka. Engineer reports indicated mixed ice thickness. Bridging teams staged prefabricated materials, while sappers marked load-bearing paths for tracked vehicles across fields drifted with snow. German operational reaction focused on holding the Korsun-Shevchenkovsky communications node long enough to shape a counterstroke from outside the threatened pocket. Army Group South instructed the 8th Army to maintain a continuous defensive arc, while panzer forces organizing in the depth prepared to strike the Soviet pincers' flanks. Elements of 3rd Panzer Corps and 47th Panzer Corps received movement orders toward assembly areas west and southwest of the salient, but their march tables were constrained by fuel delivery schedules and the need to keep some mobile units on other threatened sectors. Weather grounded much of the Luftwaffe's close support, reducing the ability to interdict Soviet columns moving on secondary tracks. By 26th to 27th January, the northern and southern Soviet spearheads extended beyond the original tactical objectives. Soviet reports noted German resistance stiffening near key road junctions, but also identified seams where withdrawn infantry formations had not yet re-established mutual support. Tank brigades pushed reconnaissance elements towards settlements on the Zvenihorodka-Shpola-Lysyanka line, while rifle corps widened corridors to secure supply routes. Ammunition expenditure remained high in the assault armies as artillery groups maintained pressure on German strongpoints to prevent organized counterattacks. Logistics staffs prioritized fuel for tank and mechanized units, routing convoys along cleared lanes and resorting to sled transport where snow depth impeded trucks. Within the salient, the German 11th and 32nd Army Corps reported increasing difficulty in maintaining continuous lines as Soviet breakthroughs deepened along both flanks. Commanders used available assault guns and limited tank assets to stabilize threatened sectors, often concentrating them at village edges to maximize fields of fire. Radio traffic indicated attempts to rotate battalions out of exposed positions, but the pace of Soviet advance strained these measures. At the same time, orders from higher command emphasized holding forward to avoid an unplanned withdrawal that could collapse the line's geometry and invite rapid encirclement. Corps staffs organized supply by night through forest lanes and across frozen streams, moving artillery ammunition and rations under blackout conditions. The Soviet encirclement concept depended on linking the two pincers west of Korsun-Shevchenkovsky before German mobile reserves could sever the corridors. On 28 January, forward detachments from the northern and southern groupings established contact in the vicinity of roads leading into Zvenihorodka's approaches, with multiple sources noting meeting points near smaller villages along that axis. The linkage, though initially slender and contested, created the conditions for a close pocket encompassing portions of 11th and 32nd Army Corps, rear services, and attached units occupying the Korsun-Shevchenkovsky area and surrounding countryside. Follow-on orders directed immediate expansion of the encirclement belt to a depth sufficient to resist relief attacks, while artillery was repositioned to interdict internal movement within the pocket and to screen the developing outer front. As the ring tightened, civilian conditions deteriorated inside and around the pocket. Villages that had been fortified since 1943 now held mixed groups of German troops, field hospitals, and local residents. Movement across open ground drew fire from both sides. Evacuation of wounded depended on horse-drawn sleds and limited motor transport. Soviet units advancing into settlements implemented procedures for screening and securing local infrastructure, while military commandant offices directed road clearance and guarded supply points. German field police managed traffic control and attempted to keep evacuation routes open toward the west, but the closure of the ring reduced options to local repositioning. At Army Group South headquarters, planning accelerated for a relief operation. Staff estimates weighed the required concentration of panzer divisions, the condition of road networks under snow, and the fuel allocations necessary for sustained offensive action. Manstein's operations staff examined axes from the southwest and west that could reach the encirclement belt near Lysyanka or further north, depending on Soviet dispositions. Meanwhile, Soviet front HQs assessed likely German relief corridors and began forming anti-tank strongpoints along probable approaches, integrating rifle regiments with artillery, and self-propelled guns to create depth in the outer defensive arc. Command and control on both sides faced friction from weather and distance. Soviet tank columns outran some radio relay stations and required liaison officers to maintain contact with neighboring formations. German corps relied on redundant nets, but reported intermittent outages due to battery failures and antenna icing. Reports from both commands emphasized the need for rapid resupply. Soviet tank units requested additional fuel trucks and winter lubricants. German infantry battalions called for mortar rounds and medical supplies. Air reconnaissance remained sporadic, limiting precise knowledge of opposing concentrations and increasing reliance on prisoner interrogations and ground patrols. By the evening of January 29th, the operational situation had transitioned from initial breakthrough to encirclement containment. Inside the newly formed pocket, German corps reorganized along interior lines to conserve ammunition and maintain maneuver space toward the west. Outside, Soviet forces reoriented to a two-front task: hold the inner ring against breakout attempts and prepare to defeat relief operations approaching from the west and southwest. The opening phase had thus set the parameters for the next decisions: the scale and axis of German relief, the allocation of Soviet reserves between the inner and outer fronts, and the management of supply in winter conditions for both the encircled and the encircling forces. With the ring closed, both commands redefined their objectives and resource allocations. For the encircled German 11th and 33rd Army Corps, immediate goals were to maintain an interior defense that preserved room for maneuver, to centralize remaining fuel and ammunition, and to prepare a controlled concentration toward a selected breakout axis. Army Group South set the external goal of driving a relief corridor from the west or southwest to a meeting point that minimized Soviet lateral shifting. The Luftwaffe was tasked to establish an air bridge scaled to daily consumption needs inside the pocket. Soviet fronts reframed their objectives accordingly. The inner front would compress and disarm the pocket by phased attacks against village strongpoints, while the outer front would build anti-tank belts and artillery kill zones along lines assessed as likely relief corridors. Staff work began with inventories. Inside the pocket, Corps quartermasters collected divisional reports of small arms rounds, mortar bombs, artillery shells, and motor fuel. Average motorization had been reduced by winter attrition and battle losses. Horse transport carried a larger share of loads. Fuel stocks were uneven. Artillery parks near Korsun Shevchenkovsky held more than infantry regiments spread among outlying villages. Ammunition tables prioritized anti-tank rounds for assault guns and the distribution of 75mm and 105mm shells to battery positions commanding open approaches. Medical services established collection points for evacuation by sled toward improvised aid stations within the town. Radio discipline was tightened to reduce traffic and preserve batteries. Luftwaffe logistics calculated sortie rates based on available Ju-52 and He-111 groups, weather forecasts, runway conditions at forward airfields, and the carrying capacity of field landing strips near the pocket. Capacity estimates fluctuated with snowfall and crosswind limits. The air plan defined a mix of parachute drops for scattered units and strip landings for loads that required handover at designated zones, with turnaround times constrained by daylight and ground crews. Daily requirements reported by the encircled corps exceeded projected lift on most days, forcing prioritization for fuel, medical supplies, and radio batteries. Soviet air armies assigned to the two fronts scheduled interdiction and cover patrols when cloud ceilings rose enough to permit fighter activity. The Soviet plan on the inner ring formalized a sector-by-sector reduction. Rifle Corps received time-phased attack tasks to seize village nodes that served as German internal road hubs. Artillery groupings were resighted to deliver counter-battery fires and rolling barrages aligned with infantry assaults. Self-propelled guns were allocated to reinforce infantry regiments tasked with cutting German movement corridors. Engineer units prepared demolition lines to break ice crossings if German columns attempted mass movement across frozen streams toward the west. Political and administrative staffs coordinated civilian evacuation from active sectors when transport was available. balancing military movement priority with protection of non-combatants. The outer ring was built around anti-tank doctrine. Soviet commanders selected ridges and village lines along the likely German relief axes to create layered fields of fire, tank destroyer regiments, anti-tank rifle battalions, and attached artillery positioned to achieve interlocking coverage at 500 to 1,000 meters along open approaches. Reserve tank and mechanized brigades stood behind these belts to counterattack any penetrations. Logistics planners stockpiled ammunition at forward dumps reachable by sled columns and shortened truck shuttles. Road maintenance detachments kept priority lanes open by clearing drifts and laying fascines where thaw created soft ground. Signal units established redundant wired lines to reduce reliance on radio under jamming and weather. Propaganda and information management formed a separate line of effort for both sides. German broadcasts to the pocket emphasized the inevitability of a relief link-up and instructed troops to hold their positions and save fuel for the final concentration. Leaflets and loudspeaker teams relayed orders and reassured units in outlying villages. Soviet newspapers for troops described the encirclement as a repeatable operational method and highlighted the coordination of the two fronts. Frontline agitators used captured documents to brief units on the enemy order of battle. Both sides monitored prisoner interrogations for indications of morale trends and supply states, but staff assessments warned against overinterpreting small samples. Intelligence estimates shaped miscalculations and corrections. German aerial reconnaissance, when cloud breaks allowed, identified Soviet concentrations on the outer ring and reported the construction of strong points on ridgelines. However, snow camouflaged many artillery positions, and gaps in coverage obscured some redeployments. Soviet reconnaissance by patrol and radio intercept established the assembly of German mobile formations outside the pocket, but weather limited precise identification of divisions and march columns. Staffs on both sides periodically overestimated opposing rates of movement, prompting premature or delayed attacks that were later rescheduled. Commanders weighed doctrine against constraints. German relief doctrine relied on concentrated panzer thrusts along narrow corridors to achieve rapid penetration and strategic surprise. Fuel forecasts, minefield clearance times, and bridge seizure plans were integrated into march tables. The encircled corps proposed a breakout plan synchronized to the arrival of relief, aiming for a meeting point along the shorter line of advance and a river crossing with sufficient ice or bridging. Soviet doctrine emphasized anti-tank defense in depth and the employment of artillery to disrupt armored spearheads before they reached prepared infantry lines. Tank counterattacks were held back to avoid piecemeal commitment, with orders to strike only when enemy columns were canalized by terrain. Civilian administration entered planning as a constraint rather than a separate objective. Soviet commandant offices documented property for future claims, organized work details for road clearance, and established curfews in liberated settlements to reduce the risk of friendly fire during night movement. German field police inside the pocket regulated traffic priority for medical and ammunition columns and documented civilian casualties for later reporting. Relief plans considered the probability that roads would be blocked by mixed traffic and prescribed military police detachments to keep lanes clear during breakout and link-up. Time emerged as a central variable. Each day in the pocket increased ammunition expenditure for perimeter defense and reduced the number of operable vehicles. Each day of preparation on the outer ring allowed the Soviet side to move more guns and mines into likely engagement areas. Airlift performance varied with weather. A 2-day sequence of grounded aircraft could force reallocation of artillery ammunition to rifle units for close defense or curtail planned counterattacks. Staff timelines placed decision points against weather windows and estimated the earliest date at which a concentrated relief force could assemble at the chosen jump-off area. By early February, plans on both sides had matured into executable orders. German relief groupings completed their concentration along roads leading toward Lysyanka and nearby crossings, with bridging equipment and assault engineers assigned to lead battalions. Inside the pocket, march routes for a breakout concentration were marked. Supply dumps were readied for destruction prior to movement, and wounded evacuation plans were finalized with sled trains. Soviet fronts finalized barrier plans, issued target lists for artillery, and designated counterattack brigades for rapid response along pre-surveyed tracks. The strategic objectives had been translated into detailed logistics and timing, setting conditions for the first major relief thrust and the corresponding effort to hold and compress the encirclement. The first collisions along the outer ring began as reconnaissance in force on January 31st and escalated into multi-division probes by February 1st to 2nd. West of the pocket, German mobile groupings assembled on roads leading to Lysyanka and adjacent river crossings, moving under blackout with march intervals increased to reduce traffic jams on snow-drifted lanes. Forward detachments, assault engineers, reconnaissance companies, and a few tanks tested Soviet positions on ridgelines that had been mined and pre-registered for artillery. Contact reports described belts of anti-tank guns in depth, camouflaged by snow, and supported by mortars positioned to cover likely debussing points. German staff officers adjusted march tables to concentrate additional artillery before committing larger armored thrusts, accepting delays caused by fuel shuttles and road maintenance. Inside the encirclement, Ektizi and Voksizikskitskitsturis, Army Corps reorganized their perimeter into sectors anchored on village strongpoints. Infantry battalions thinned their forward trenches to conserve ammunition, holding platoon outposts under orders to withdraw by prearranged signals rather than risk local encirclement. Assault guns were kept mobile on interior roads marked for load-bearing capacity over ice, tasked to move by short bounds to disrupt Soviet battalion-sized pushes. Radios were husbanded by limiting transmissions to hourly situation updates and pre-formatted fire requests. Corps engineers fortified likely breakout lanes toward the west, with snow-packed berms to conceal assembly areas and mark sled routes for overnight resupply. Soviet forces initiated systematic reduction of the pocket beginning February 1st. Rifle Corps attacked village nodes in timed sets, each preceded by counter-battery missions and rolling barrages designed to cut wire and suppress machine gun nests. Self-propelled guns accompanied assault platoons into the outskirts, then shifted to flanking fire against German movement corridors. Where the defense held, commanders disengaged and moved to adjacent targets rather than exhaust ammunition in frontal attrition. The objective was to compress the perimeter while keeping German units off balance, forcing them to consume mortar rounds and anti-tank ammunition faster than airlift could replenish them. Airlift operations began under marginal weather. Field landing strips near Korsun-Shevchenkovsky were prepared with packed snow and marked by signal panels when visibility permitted. Transport sorties varied day to day with cloud ceilings and crosswinds. Loads prioritized aviation fuel for liaison aircraft, medical supplies, radio batteries, and small arms ammunition. Heavier items were parachute dropped to units outside the town. Reports from the encircled corps indicated that daily deliveries met only a fraction of requested tonnage, with fluctuations that complicated fire planning and vehicle allocation. Soviet fighter regiments increased patrols when the weather cleared, while anti-aircraft batteries near the outer ring engaged transport aircraft attempting low-altitude approaches. On February 2nd to 3rd, German relief forces executed larger probes towards Soviet blocking lines. The lead echelons, tanks with mounted panzer grenadiers, tested mine belts and sought to draw counter-battery fire to identify gun positions. Assault engineers advanced behind tank screens to cut lanes through wire and mines under smoke. Progress was recorded in kilometers rather than tens of kilometers, as Soviet artillery concentrated on road junctions and defiles where vehicles were canalized by terrain and snow. When penetrations occurred, Soviet commanders fed in tank brigades from second-line assembly areas to strike the flanks and restore linearity to the defense. The exchanges consumed fuel and ammunition on both sides at rates higher than anticipated in staff tables. Within the pocket, 3 to 4 February saw localized Soviet gains that reduced maneuver space and divided some German company positions. German counterattacks at village edges aimed to restore the perimeter, often deploying assault guns to fire along street axes where fields of fire were predictable. Medical services reported increased casualties from shell fragments and close-in village fighting. Evacuation relied on hand sleds to aid stations set in basements. Civilian movement was restricted by both commands to reduce confusion. Curfews and controlled crossings attempted to separate non-combatants from military routes. Supply remained a night task, with horse-drawn columns bringing mortar rounds and rations forward under blackout. Communications shaped momentum. German relief headquarters relied on intermittent air reconnaissance to map Soviet gun lines and identify reserves held behind the outer ring, but cloud cover produced gaps that forced reliance on prisoner interrogations and intercepted radio traffic. Soviet front headquarters used wired communications where possible to limit jamming with radio relays for mobile groups. Patrols from both sides contested control of small woods and isolated hamlets that could host observation posts. Possession of a two-story structure with a clear view of a road bend could determine the viability of a morning attack. Logistics drove operational pacing. German fuel columns operating from depots west of the relief sector ran shuttles under guard, pausing at prearranged refuel points to top off spearhead tanks before each push. Winter-grade lubricants were rationed. Maintenance platoons reported increased breakdowns from cold starts and track damage on ice. Soviet ammunition dumps were established behind the blocking lines at sled range, with artillery regiment wagons assigned fixed shuttle schedules to sustain counter-battery fire. Road detachments cut new lanes along field margins to reduce predictability, marking them with branches to guide night convoys. Air support fluctuated. On days with higher ceilings, the Luftwaffe directed fighter bombers against Soviet artillery positions and moving columns, while Soviet ground attack aircraft sought to hit German assembly areas and roadheads. Both sides learned to shift columns into tree lines or village streets at the first warning of air activity. Claims of vehicles destroyed varied in after-action reports. Ground verification remained limited by the speed of night recovery and snow cover. By February 5th, the pattern solidified. German relief attacks pressed against a defended belt designed to absorb and canalize, while the Encircle Corps resisted Soviet compression with short counterattacks and disciplined withdrawals from untenable points. Staff assessments on the German side concluded that a single, narrow thrust with stronger artillery preparation would be required to break the ring, but such concentration demanded additional fuel and ammunition that were still en route. Soviet assessments warned that a relief corridor, if opened even temporarily, could enable a breakout concentration from inside the pocket. Orders emphasized the rapid construction of anti-tank knots at likely junctions and the retention of mobile reserves for immediate counterthrusts. Civilian conditions in the engagement zones reflected the operational demands. Property records were taken for later compensation claims, wells were tested and guarded to prevent contamination, and work details were assigned to snow clearance on priority military routes. Local administrations coordinated with military commandant offices to reopen bakeries and mills where possible to reduce pressure on army rations. Evacuations proceeded when transport could be spared, typically by sled convoys moving at night along marked tracks to rear villages. The initial clashes thus defined the parameters for the next phase. Relief forces had identified viable approach corridors, but had not yet linked to the pocket. The Encircle Corps preserved interior lines and prepared march plans for a concentration toward the west, contingent on a relief breach. The Soviet side maintained the inner ring and reinforced the outer belt with additional guns and mines. Both commands recalculated timelines based on attrition rates, weather forecasts, and the daily variability of the airlift, setting decision points for a larger relief effort and, in response, for the defense of the outer ring to be tested by concentrated armored thrusts. Early February brought an escalation that strained command systems and narrowed options. German relief headquarters finalized a plan for a concentrated thrust along the shortest road network to the encirclement belt near Lysyanka and adjacent river crossings. March tables synchronized artillery groups, assault engineers, bridging detachments, and led panzer battalions, with fuel points established at fixed intervals. The concept required uninterrupted movement over several hours in winter daylight, followed by rapid expansion of a breach wide enough to secure two-way traffic. Inside the pocket, 11th and 32nd Army Corps shifted from a circular defense to a defense in depth aligned with prospective breakout routes, thinning less vital sectors and pulling service units into rear assembly areas. Soviet fronts, reading the same map geometry, converted reconnaissance notes into layered defenses, anti-tank knots set on ridges, artillery registered on defiles, and mobile reserves prepositioned to counterattack any penetration before it could be widened. Weather remained a decisive factor. Alternating snow and brief thaws created a cycle of crusted drifts over soft sublayers that punished wheeled vehicles and slowed tracked movement. On days with low cloud, Luftwaffe transport and close support missions dropped to minimums. On clearer days, sorties rose but still lagged behind the consumption curve inside the pocket. By 6 to 7 February, German reports noted that daily air deliveries met only a fraction of requirements for artillery ammunition and motor fuel, forcing rationing measures that reduced artillery firing programs to essential counter-preparation and local support. Soviet aviation, limited by the same weather, concentrated on interdiction along a few predictable roadheads and on opportunistic strikes against parked columns during refuel halts. Crisis features appeared in staff logs. The Encircled Corps reported cumulative losses that reduced infantry battalion rifle strengths and limited the number of assault guns available for local counterattacks. Ammunition expenditures for defensive mortars and anti-tank guns exceeded replacement rates, compelling sector commanders to restrict fires to pre-registered lines. Horse casualties from overwork and exposure degraded the pocket's internal transport. Sled routes lengthened as Soviet compressing attacks pinched village salients. German medical services flagged rising numbers of frostbite cases in addition to shell wounds. Soviet rifle regiments engaged in the reduction of village nodes recorded steady attrition of junior leaders and requested additional submachine guns and hand grenades for house-to-house fighting, while artillery units logged barrel wear from sustained firing in cold conditions. Political and command pressures reinforced operational choices. Orders from higher German command stressed holding the pocket's perimeter and conserving fuel for a centrally directed breakout timed to a relief breach. Requests from the Encircled Corps to attempt earlier, smaller-scale sorties were denied in favor of a single, synchronized effort. On the Soviet side, front HQs emphasized preventing any linkage at all. Outer ring commanders were cautioned to avoid pursuit beyond surveyed fire zones that could expose their flanks, and inner ring commanders were ordered to keep compression steady rather than rush costly assaults against well-prepared strongpoints. Both sides used liaison officers to maintain horizontal coordination between neighboring formations. Where radio failed, runners and ski patrols carried orders, introducing delays that affected the synchronization of artillery and maneuver. By 8th to 9th February, German relief forces executed deeper thrusts. Assault engineers cleared narrow lanes through mine belts under smoke, and tanks advanced in wedge formations to reach the first Soviet trench systems. Artillery concentrations on both sides intensified. German guns massed fires to lift anti-tank ambushes at road bends, while Soviet batteries engaged in counter-battery and defensive barrages designed to halt spearheads short of ridge crests. Gains were measurable in villages taken and kilometers advanced, but each step forward narrowed supply tails and consumed fuel at rates exceeding planned resupply. Night maintenance cycles lengthened as crews replaced track pins and road wheels damaged by ice rubble. Inside the pocket, the perimeter contracted as Soviet attacks seized additional hamlets and woodlots. German Corps staff prioritized retaining a corridor of maneuver space along the chosen breakout vector, reinforcing it with assault guns, mortars, and remaining heavy machine guns. Local counterattacks at dusk attempted to recover tactically useful high ground, sometimes succeeding for hours before renewed Soviet pressure forced reversion to fallback lines. Civilian administration functioned under constraint. Medical stations shared basements with field hospitals, bakeries operated intermittently under rationing, and wells were guarded against overuse. Soviet commandant offices in recently captured localities documented property and organized work details to clear roads, while military police regulated traffic to keep artillery columns moving toward new firing positions. Intelligence misreads compounded risk. German aerial reconnaissance, when possible, sketched Soviet reserves behind the outer ring, but underestimated the density of anti-tank positions on secondary ridges. Soviet patrols identified assembly areas for German panzer battle groups, but sometimes misattributed decoy movements to larger formations, prompting premature reinforcement of quiet sectors. Both sides intercepted radio traffic and analyzed patterns of message volume. Conclusions were tested by ground probes that drew fire to confirm or refute assessments. The resulting picture remained incomplete, and operational decisions were made against uncertainty regarding the opponent's true concentration and fuel state. Logistics became the limiting variable for decisive action. German depots west of the relief sector shuttled fuel forward in guarded convoys, but bottlenecks at bridge approaches and snow-choked woods limited throughput. Stockpiles intended to create a one-time surge for a breakthrough accumulated slowly, delaying the date for a major push. Inside the pocket, fuel was pooled for essential vehicles and for a future concentration march, with strict prohibitions on non-mission movement. Soviet artillery ammunition expenditure was high but sustainable. Fronts redistributed shells along the outer ring to weight-likely engagement zones, using narrow-gauge rail where available and sled columns elsewhere. Engineer units on both sides worked continuously, clearing drifts, reinforcing culverts, laying fascines, and repairing ice crossings that thaw cycles weakened by midday and refroze by night. Commanders marked mid-February as the decision window. German planning set a target date by which two conditions needed to align: a relief breach open to the inner ring, and authorization for the encircled corps to break out along a single axis toward the breach. The encircled corps rehearsed march sequences by map: assault gun screens in front, infantry battalions in column with sleds and handcarts, medical and signals elements interspersed, rear guards to delay pursuit. Soviet fronts, expecting such a move, reinforced anti-tank knots along river lines and defiles selected as likely crossing points. Artillery fire plans assigned pre-arranged concentrations to time-on-target schedules intended to hit breakout columns during river approaches and at road bends beyond. Crisis management extended to communications with higher political authorities. German reports stressed the necessity of a coordinated timing to avoid dissipating fuel in failed attempts. Assurances were given that the pocket could hold if resupply improved and compression remained manageable. Soviet reports emphasized incremental gains and the construction of depth on the outer ring. Requests for additional tanks and heavy guns were balanced against demands from other sectors of the winter campaign. The outcome turned less on abstract doctrine than on the ability to execute a chosen plan under winter conditions, with incomplete information and constrained supply. By 12th to 13th February, escalation had brought both sides to the threshold of irreversible choices. Relief forces stood within several kilometers of Soviet blocking lines along the selected corridor, but had not yet forced a sustained rupture. The encircled corps had concentrated along their designated axis, ready to move once external pressure opened the ring. The Soviet defense had absorbed successive blows and relayered its belts, with counterattack groups positioned at road junctions and near likely river crossings. With timelines converging and stocks committed, the campaign entered a phase in which a single day's weather window and a narrow sequence of decisions could decide whether a relief corridor would be carved open or whether the pocket would be compelled to attempt a breakout against intact defenses. By 14th February, the operation reached its peak tempo. Outside the pocket, German relief forces compressed into a narrow corridor west of Lysychanka. After several days of incremental gains that aligned roads, artillery positions, and engineer assets for a concentrated push. Inside the encirclement, XE and XXKSK's Army Corps completed a staged contraction toward assembly areas oriented on a single breakout axis. Command posts were rearranged to shorten lines to assault elements. Rear services prepared to destroy non-portable stocks, and march columns were structured with assault guns at the head. Infantry battalions in file, medical and signals. Echelons interleaved, and rear guards designated for delaying tasks. Soviet fronts completed an outer defensive belt that combined minefields, interlocking anti-tank positions, and pre-registered artillery concentrations focused on road bends and river approaches, while the inner ring maintained pressure to keep German units consumed with local counterattacks and area defense. Artillery density defined the engagements of the 14th to 15th of February. German relief headquarters massed field and heavy batteries to roll barrages forward ahead of spearhead tanks, using observation from church towers and ridge lines when weather allowed. Counter-battery radars were not available. Sound ranging and flash spotting teams guided adjustment by map and observation. Soviet artillery groups replied with depth barrages designed to break up wedges before they crested ridges and to saturate likely engineer work sites where assault teams cut lanes through mine belts. Ammunition expenditure rates on both sides exceeded previous days. German headquarters redistributed shells from supporting sectors to the main axis, while Soviet dumps pushed 76mm and 122mm rounds by sled shuttles to keep planned concentrations on schedule. Air activity occurred in short windows. When ceilings briefly lifted, German fighter bombers struck Soviet gun positions and vehicle parks near the blocking line, while Soviet ground attack aircraft flew against German roadheads and refuel points. Claims and after-action reports varied. Both commands cautioned staffs to treat aerial assessments as indicative rather than decisive. The limiting factor remained movement on snow-choked roads. Engineers cut bypasses along field margins to avoid predictable routes. Traffic control points enforced spacing to prevent roadblocks from a single disabled vehicle. Fuel distribution, tied to turnaround rates from depots in the German rear and to the fluctuating airlift into the pocket, became the bottleneck for sustained offensive momentum. Inside the pocket, village fighting intensified as Soviet units pressed the perimeter to reduce German maneuver space. Company-sized strong points anchored by machine guns and mortars traded streets multiple times in a day. German assault guns fired down straight lanes to disrupt infantry infiltration. Soviet self-propelled guns answered from flanking positions. Medical stations filled basements. Evacuation proceeded by hand sled and horse-drawn carts when roads were under fire. Corps engineers marked night routes for the forthcoming concentration, flagging culverts, low bridges, and ice crossings with branch bundles and lantern codes understood by column guides. Radio nets were kept to essential traffic to preserve batteries for the decisive movement. High command decisions converged with operational realities on February 15th to 16th. Reports from the relief axis indicated that forward elements had reached within several kilometers of Soviet blocking lines, screening the encirclement belt, but repeated attempts to widen penetrations stalled against mines, anti-tank positions, and artillery concentrations. Inside the pocket, ammunition stocks for heavy weapons were low. Fuel was pooled to support assault guns and essential trucks, and infantry battalions reported reduced rifle strength. The forecast predicted a temporary improvement in visibility, followed by renewed snowfall and high winds, a combination that could alternately permit limited air support and then favor ground movement under cover of drifting snow. Authorization for a coordinated breakout was issued during 16th February, aligned with a renewed external thrust. The order specified a westward axis toward the nearest contact point with relief forces, aiming to cross frozen river channels and break through Soviet blocking detachments guarding road junctions. Corps instructions set out time-on-target artillery preparations to mask the initial movement. Prioritized sled-borne ammunition for infantry leading echelons, and prescribed destruction of remaining dumps and documents at H-hour minus 30 minutes. March discipline was codified. No fires except on direct orders, no halts except at pre-marked refuel and reorganization points, and immediate bypass of disabled vehicles to keep the column moving. Soviet fronts anticipated the timing. Defensive knots along the projected breakout corridor were reinforced with additional anti-tank guns, mines were reseeded on likely bypasses, and artillery tables were recalculated to deliver concentrated fire at river approaches and road bends beyond the first defensive line. Reserve tank and mechanized brigades were held in covered assembly areas with orders to counterattack along pre-surveyed tracks the moment German columns entered kill zones. On the inner ring, rifle corps maintained pressure on village salients to prevent the encircled troops from withdrawing units to strengthen the breakout spearhead. Civilians caught within the pocket or along the breakout axis faced compounded risks. Movement restrictions were tightened. Curfews and controlled corridors separated non-combatant routes from military traffic where possible. Local administrations maintained minimal services. Wells were guarded and rationed. Bakeries operated intermittently under Army supervision, and field hospitals requested additional blankets, disinfectants, and bandages. Outside the pocket, evacuated villages hosted displaced families under ad hoc arrangements coordinated by commandant offices. Work details supported snow clearance on priority military lanes, and lists were compiled for later property claims. Coordination between the relief force and the breakout columns depended on time signals and ground markers more than on radio confirmation. Both sides anticipated jamming and intermittent outages. German staff officers designated flare colors and recognition panels. Soviet units rehearsed counterflare signals and trained observers to distinguish false markers. The relief plan synchronized artillery lifts with the expected arrival of the breakout spearhead at specific terrain points. The defensive plan arranged time-on-target barrages at those same points based on estimated movement rates. The result was a race between two clockworks, each built on imperfect estimates of the other's pace. Logistics set the last constraints before movement. Fuel for the relief panzer battalions was staged at forward points for a one-time surge. Replacements for damaged tanks were limited. Inside the pocket, assault guns received priority refueling. Horses were rested for several hours to pull medical sleds during the night march. Ammunition for infantry was packed on hand sleds and small carts. Heavy artillery shells were largely expended or destroyed in place to prevent capture. Weather aligned with the schedule. Gusting winds and snow squalls reduced visibility by the evening of the 16th of February, masking assembly movements but complicating navigation. At dusk, the encircled columns moved to start lines. Guides checked compass bearings against pre-marked stakes, and assault guns tested engines in low idle to avoid exhaust plumes that could silhouette the lead ranks. The relief axis, already engaged throughout the day, prepared to intensify pressure. Soviet outposts reported increased noise and movement, but faced the same visibility constraints. Artillery clocks ticked toward programmed times. The stage was set for a night breakout through snow and against layered defenses, with contact points measured in kilometers and hours rather than maps and plans. Conditions that would determine whether a link-up could be achieved or whether the encircled force would be compelled to force crossings under fire without external support. The breakout began under snow squalls on the evening of February 16th. Columns formed from assembly areas around Shenderivka and neighboring villages, arranged as prescribed. Assault guns forward with pioneer detachments, infantry battalions in narrow files, medical sleds interspersed, rear guards with machine guns and mortars. Guides moved by compass along pre-marked stakes and tree lines. Fires were restricted to pre-arranged signals. Radios remained mostly silent to conserve batteries and reduce direction-finding risk. Behind the marching echelons, demolition teams destroyed remaining dumps and disabled guns that could not be towed. Within minutes, the lead elements were in contact with Soviet outposts positioned along hedgerows and shallow rises west of the pocket. Soviet blocking detachments executed a layered defense. Forward pickets used flares sparingly to avoid revealing main positions, then fell back to primary trenches once contact was confirmed. Anti-tank guns were sighted on reverse slopes and at road bends, with pre-measured ranges. Mortar crews engaged likely assembly hollows and stream crossings. Artillery delivered time-on-target concentrations when observers detected movement clustered at bottlenecks. On several approach lanes, minefields funneled the columns into low ground where interlocking fields of fire could be applied. Where German assault guns forced a gap with short bursts at close range, reserve rifle platoons counterattacked to reclose the lane, accepting short-distance engagements in drifting snow. By midnight, the relief force outside the ring intensified pressure along its own axis. Artillery batteries lifted barrages by schedule to mask engineer teams clearing new lanes through Soviet obstacles, and tanks advanced in wedge formations under limited visibility. Coordination with the breakout columns relied on estimations of pace rather than verified signals. Both commands reported contradictory sounds and flashes in storm conditions that distorted direction. Artillery plans were adjusted by minutes rather than tens of minutes to avoid friendly fire. In the pocket, march discipline held. Halted vehicles were bypassed to prevent roadblocks, and wounded unable to move were consolidated for later evacuation. The WWII River line, shallow in summer but swollen by thaw and snowmelt over ice, became the decisive terrain. The breakout axis converged on fords and footbridges west of Shenderivka toward Lysyanka. Reconnaissance had marked crossing points earlier, but the freeze-thaw cycle had weakened ice near bends and shallows. Pioneers tested the first crossings. Some held, others broke under the weight of vehicles. Assault boats were limited and had to be carried forward by hand. When ice failed, infantry crossed in files, linked by ropes, while assault guns sought alternate points. Soviet artillery, pre-registered on fords, engaged with concentrations. Machine gun positions on the far bank directed grazing fire along exit slopes. Where smoke was available, it concealed movement only partially in the wind. Casualties rose as columns compressed on the near bank. Corps engineers improvised. Fascines and planks were laid to broaden narrow ice tongues. Ropes were fixed across the current. Hand carts were pushed on their sides as makeshift sleds. A limited number of vehicles made it across at stronger points where ice thickness and bank gradients allowed. Many heavy weapons and trucks were abandoned to keep the column flowing. Medical teams worked on the near and far banks, pulling men from water and treating hypothermia alongside wounds. Reports from Soviet rifle regiments on the far bank noted countercharges by German infantry immediately after crossing to expand the foothold and open headroom for following echelons. Before dawn on 17 February, segments of the breakout column established contact with forward patrols from the relief force near villages west of the river line. The contact was partial and local. Small groups passed through gaps created by night fighting and moved into areas recently contested by the external thrust. Signals for recognition, flares, and panels were used, but cloud base and blowing snow limited visibility. Attempts to widen these contacts into a continuous corridor encountered renewed Soviet fire as batteries shifted targets to exit roads and as tank and mechanized reserves executed planned counterattacks against road junctions. The relief spearheads, operating at the edge of fuel tables and under artillery interdiction, were unable to hold a broad passage for long. Inside the shrinking perimeter east of the river, the rear elements of the breakout continued to move under pressure. Soviet attacks from the inner ring closed on the staging villages, reducing room for maneuver and severing some of the pre-marked routes. Rear guards fought delaying actions at hedgerows and barn lines to buy minutes for stretcher teams and stragglers to reach the crossings. Destruction teams completed tasks at remaining dumps. Companion columns attempted alternate approaches to less contested bends in the river, accepting additional distance in exchange for reduced fire. Where crossings were no longer viable for vehicles, crews removed breach blocks or set explosive charges to deny equipment. The external relief force recalculated options. Ammunition and fuel logistics along the relief axis were nearing the limit for another deep push that day. Road congestion and mined defiles slowed resupply. Commanders sought to concentrate remaining assets for a final attempt to punch farther east. But the time window before daylight and improving Soviet observation narrowed. Artillery was retasked to interdict Soviet counterattack assembly points rather than to maintain rolling barrages. Engineers were ordered to prepare defensive works in case the relief spearheads had to transition from attack to cover for withdrawing elements. Soviet command on the outer ring adapted to the night's developments. Reserve brigades pivoted toward crossings where reports indicated heavier movement. Artillery liaison officers moved forward to observation points to shorten the loop for massed fires. Engineers reseeded mines on roads used by early German groups and extended obstacles onto field margins to prevent bypasses. Orders emphasized destroying crossing sites, already weakened by the first waves, and using direct-fire anti-tank guns at short range on exit slopes to stall any renewed movement at first light. Air units prepared to sortie, if ceilings lifted to strike vehicles clustered on roadheads west of the river. Civilian experiences during the night varied by location. Houses along approach lanes were used as aid stations and shelter points. Families took in wounded from both sides when fighting paused, then evacuated at command orders when sectors became active. Wells near crossings were rationed to preserve ice integrity at banks. Livestock was driven away from lanes to reduce congestion. Administrations in villages west of the river managed influxes of stragglers and small groups who had crossed, organizing temporary quarters in schools and churches and recording identities when possible for later processing or return to units. By mid-morning on February 17th, outcomes diverged across the breakout front. Groups that had crossed during the darkest hours and linked with forward elements of the relief force moved west under guidance, many without heavy equipment and with mixed unit composition. Others were halted on the near bank or dispersed by artillery and counterattacks on exit roads. Commanders inside the pocket reported battalions reduced by fragmentation during the crossing and by the need to screen both flanks against Soviet pressure. Relief headquarters forwarded fuel and ammunition to units holding the nearest high ground beyond the river, but the capacity to escort larger numbers eastward to open a durable corridor was limited. Operationally, the attempt registered as a partial success in passages achieved and as a failure in creating a sustained link. The encircled corps had executed the planned concentration and movement. The relief force had pushed close enough to meet elements at the river. The decisive factors, river conditions under freeze-thaw, density and positioning of Soviet anti-tank defenses, and the fuel and ammunition state of the relief spearheads, prevented a broad, lasting corridor. The process continued into the afternoon as smaller groups attempted delayed crossings, some succeeding under local smokescreens, others turning back or being captured when encircled by counterattacks. By evening, both commands adjusted to the results. German staff recorded the numbers that had reached friendly lines west of the river and the estimated strength still east of it. Orders prioritized extraction of wounded and consolidation of mixed groups into ad hoc battalions. Soviet staffs tallied prisoners taken at failed crossings and at cut-off pockets along the approach lanes, moved guns forward to new firing positions, and reported the closure of most crossing points. The day's events narrowed remaining options for those still inside the pocket and set the stage for the final phase. Disorganized attempts to escape in small clusters, continued local Soviet reductions of strong points, and the gradual transition by the relief force from attack to screening and recovery of survivors. By 17th to 18th February, the situation crystallized into divergent outcomes along short stretches of the front. West of the Hanilaya Tikich, relief spearheads held patches of high ground and villages, but lacked fuel and ammunition to keep corridors open under sustained Soviet artillery and counterattacks. East of the river, mixed groups from the 11th and 32nd Army Corps continued to attempt crossings at night and early morning, guided by pre-marked stakes and aided by pioneer detachments. Reports from several Soviet rifle regiments recorded the capture of small columns that had become disoriented in snow squalls and ran into mine belts reseeded overnight. Other groups reached the far bank in platoon and company strength, leaving behind most vehicles and heavy weapons. Command posts on both sides tracked these movements with incomplete data, relying on messenger accounts and prisoner interrogations to update maps. A turning point emerged at the river exits and the first road junctions beyond them. Soviet fronts shifted artillery and self-propelled guns forward to positions that commanded the exit slopes and the nearest bends, shortening the time for massed fires. Reserve brigades pre-positioned the previous evening counterattacked as German echelons compressed at bottlenecks, trading ground in meters to prevent any broadening of the passage. German relief units, having advanced to within several kilometers of the inner ring, attempted to expand local gains into a stable corridor, but encountered cumulative constraints, fuel deliveries limited to one more push. Assault engineers engaged simultaneously in clearance and ad hoc bridge repair, and the need to hold defensive arcs against Soviet tanks that struck from surveyed tracks. The tempo of fire and counterfire exceeded the resupply rate along snowbound roads. Inside the pocket, command shifted from a single coordinated breakout to multiple cluster movements. Battalion and company leaders organized ad hoc groups when Original march columns fragmented. Assault guns with fuel remaining led short thrusts to reach alternate fords. When ice failed or exit slopes were dominated by direct-fire guns, crews spiked weapons and joined infantry on foot. Records from Soviet units on the far bank noted firefights at close range near tree lines and farmsteads used as interim assembly points by groups that had crossed. Medical services on both sides worked under scarcity. Field dressings and morphine were rationed. Evacuation was prioritized for frostbite and chest wounds. Heated shelters were limited. German High Command authorized continued attempts through the night of February 17th to 18th, but assessed by midday that external pressure could not maintain a corridor of sufficient width and duration to pass large formations. Relief artillery shifted to interdiction of Soviet counterattack assembly areas to cover the withdrawal of units that had reached the far bank and were consolidating westward. Air support remained irregular. Brief windows allowed fighter bombers to strike crossroads used by Soviet reserves, but low ceilings returned and grounded most missions. Transport sorties into the pocket had already fallen below minimum requirements. Landing strips were within artillery range, and snow conditions complicated approaches. On February 18th, reports from multiple German sources indicated the death of the 11th Corps commander, Wilhelm Stemmermann, during movements near the breakout axis when artillery fire struck his group. Accounts varied on the exact location, citing areas west of Shenderivka and near Nova Buda. Command responsibilities devolved to divisional leaders coordinating local withdrawals or final attempts to cross. Concurrently, Soviet Rifle Corps completed the seizure of several staging villages east of the river, cutting market approach lanes and isolating remnants that had not moved during the peak window. Engineer teams destroyed remaining ice routes judged unsafe or likely to be reused in daylight. Civilian administration transitioned from emergency measures to processing and stabilizing newly secured areas. Soviet commandant offices registered property for eventual restitution processes, assigned work parties to clear roads and repair culverts, and organized temporary shelters for displaced families and for prisoners awaiting transfer to rear camps. German military police west of the river sorted men who had crossed into formed elements for onward movement, while medical staff triaged cases for transport. Administrative friction persisted. Lists of missing were incomplete. Some small groups moved without orders in search of friendly units. And night movement continued along secondary lanes, where control was looser. Equipment outcomes reflected the constraints of winter crossings under fire. Heavy artillery, the majority of vehicles, and much of the heavy infantry equipment remained east of the river or was destroyed in place. Horses, critical for hauling ammunition and evacuating wounded, suffered high losses from exposure and shelling. Those that survived were often left behind when columns transitioned to foot movement. Soviet recovery detachments cataloged captured materiel for redistribution or destruction, prioritizing serviceable small arms, machine guns, and radio equipment. German reports recorded the loss of most heavy weapons in exchange for the passage of personnel in fragmented groups. By the evening of the 18th of February, operational momentum had shifted decisively away from the prospect of a sustained link-up. Relief headquarters acknowledged that fuel and ammunition on the spearheads were at levels that precluded another deep push before Soviet reserves could further strengthen the blocking lines. Inside the original encirclement, remaining organized resistance contracted into pockets around woodlots and hamlets, with fire discipline imposed to conserve ammunition for short-range defense and final attempts to move at dusk. Soviet inner ring formations received orders to complete the reduction sector by sector, emphasizing envelopment of strong points and the cutoff of routes leading toward remaining crossing sites. The immediate tactical results translated into specific numbers and categories rather than general descriptors. Several tens of thousands of German personnel were assessed to have broken out in groups ranging from squads to battalions, many without organic heavy equipment. A significant number were captured east of the river or at crossing points. Soviet reports enumerated prisoners by regiment and support unit where identification was possible. Killed and missing figures were being compiled by both sides, with later historiography estimating German deaths in the range of tens of thousands across the encirclement and breakout. And with an equipment ledger showing the abandonment of most vehicles and guns inside the pocket. Soviet casualty figures, distributed across inner ring reduction and outer ring defense, reflected heavy expenditures in village assaults, anti-tank engagements, and counterattacks against relief attempts. Unit returns, recorded losses by day and by mission type. Strategically, the turning point at Korsun-Shevchenkovsky produced immediate and downstream effects. For Army Group South, the attrition of infantry formations, the loss of heavy equipment, and the failure to re-establish a stable line on the eastern bank reduced capacity to hold right bank Ukraine in subsequent weeks. For the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts, the elimination of the pocket-freed formations for the next operational tasks along the Uman and southern Buyuk axes. Rail repair units began work to restore lines through the area to support further advances. Road maintenance detachments widened lanes to carry supplies forward. Both sides adjusted plans. German commands prepared new defensive lines farther west. Soviet staff scheduled subsequent operations that would test those lines, with logistics arranged for longer supply routes as the front moved. By 19th February, the character of the fighting shifted from concentrated attempt and response to localized clearances and withdrawals. Small groups continued to try to move under cover of darkness. Soviet patrols and blocking units intercepted some, and reported others passing through gaps created by terrain and weather. Relief formations transitioned to screen lines, recovering survivors and preparing for counterattacks only if Soviet forces pushed beyond surveyed limits. The turning point had thus been reached not through a single decisive act, but through the intersection of weather, river conditions, fire concentration, and supply curves that determined whether a corridor could be held open. The result set the conditions for immediate cleanup operations and for the next phase of the campaign westward. By 19th to 20th February, organized combat inside the encirclement had contracted to scattered resistance in woodlots and farmsteads east of the Hanili Taikich. Soviet rifle regiments and guards formations executed sector clearances with platoon and company assaults, supported by short, concentrated artillery fires to avoid unnecessary expenditure. German remnants attempted short dashes at dusk toward minor crossings or tree-line gaps. Many were intercepted by patrols or blocked by mined approaches reseeded overnight. Where groups surrendered, procedures followed standing orders: disarmament, search, recording of identities when papers existed, and transfer to rear collection points under guard. On several roads, the last horse-drawn columns, burdened with wounded, were halted by anti-tank guns positioned for direct fire at close range. Surviving personnel were taken prisoner after brief exchanges. The relief force west of the river consolidated along a screen that combined villages on high ground with prepared anti-tank positions. Fuel and ammunition stocks were insufficient for renewed deep thrusts, and orders shifted to recovering stragglers and stabilizing a line that could absorb Soviet probes without inviting envelopment. Mixed groups that had broken out during the night of the 16th to the 17th of February were reorganized into ad hoc battalions, integrated with rear echelon troops brought forward to fill ranks. Medical services prioritized frostbite cases and chest and abdominal wounds. Evacuation trains moved west from railheads when lines were clear of interdiction. Commanders reported the loss of most heavy weapons and vehicles from the encircled formations, with small numbers of assault guns and trucks recovered, if they had crossed intact. Soviet commandant offices established layered administration in newly secured localities. Military police regulated traffic to keep artillery and engineer columns moving. Property registries recorded damage and requisitioned items for future compensation processes. Burial teams collected bodies from open ground and village streets as weather allowed. Mine-clearing detachments marked safe lanes for civilians and troops, while engineer companies repaired culverts and reinforced bridges to carry supply trucks heading west. Rear area hospitals received a steady flow of wounded from inner ring reductions and outer ring defensive battles. Surgical teams worked through the night in schools and municipal buildings converted to operating stations. Reports from front headquarters noted that ammunition expenditure remained high, but within replenishment capacity as rail repair units brought additional spurs into service. Prisoner processing expanded rapidly, captured soldiers from the Encircle Corps were moved in stages from battalion collection points to regimental cages and then to front-level camps. Interrogations focused on order of battle details, unit strengths, and fuel states during the final days. Many prisoners had discarded insignia and mixed with soldiers from other units. Identification relied on paybooks when available and on cross-checks with captured rosters. For the Soviet side, prisoner counts served both intelligence and propaganda aims. For the German side, lists of missing and captured, compiled from survivor accounts and radio intercepts, were incomplete for weeks and were revised repeatedly. Civilian after-effects were immediate. Families who had sheltered in cellars during village fighting emerged to assess damage. Roofs collapsed under snow and shell hits. Wells contaminated by debris, livestock lost or scattered. Soviet authorities organized emergency food distributions, where stocks permitted and arranged transport for vulnerable populations to nearby towns less affected by the fighting. Work details, often mixed civilian and military, cleared roads of abandoned carts and vehicles, and filled shell holes to restore school and market access. In some localities, administrative teams reopened bakeries and mills under Army supervision to reduce the demand on military rations. Casualty accounting proceeded in parallel with reorganization. On the German side, Corps and Army staffs estimated that a substantial portion of the encircled personnel had either been killed, captured, or dispersed, with later compilations placing deaths on the order of tens of thousands and prisoners in the tens of thousands as well. Survivors who reached friendly lines often did so without heavy equipment and with reduced unit cohesion. On the Soviet side, losses were spread across the inner ring assaults, the artillery duels and counterattacks along the outer ring, and the night fighting at crossings. Unit returns itemized casualties by day and mission type, reflecting the cost of village reduction and anti-tank defense under winter conditions. Both sides acknowledged that frozen ground delayed comprehensive burial and recovery, complicating precise counts. Operationally, the encirclement and breakout attempts concluded with the area east of the WWII Taikich cleared by 18th to 19th February, and with the relief force no longer attempting to drive corridors to the river. The loss of heavy equipment in the pocket and during the crossing-shaped German planning, divisions that emerged were redesignated as Kampfgruppen for defensive tasks farther west, pending refit that supply and manpower constraints could not quickly provide. Army Group South issued orders to establish new defense lines oriented on the southern Bug and toward Uman, with bridging assets and field positions concentrated along likely Soviet axes. The Luftwaffe adjusted priorities away from airlift to interdiction and defensive support, constrained by weather and aircraft availability. For the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts, the reduction of the Korsun-Shevchenkovsky pocket-freed rifle corps, tank armies, and artillery groups for the continuation of the winter campaign on right bank Ukraine. Rail repair battalions worked to restore the Znamyanka-Smyla-Kristanivka network and connecting lines to support westward advances. Staff planning shifted to operations toward Uman and the southern Bug, with logistics extending supply lines across recently contested terrain. Reports to Stavka highlighted captured materiel, the collapse of organized resistance inside the pocket, and the timely defeat of relief attempts as evidence that combined arms encirclement methods could be repeated where salient geometry and reserve density permitted. Information policy reflected each side's priorities. German communiques emphasized the rescue of large numbers of troops from encirclement, the severity of weather and river conditions, and the continued ability to form defensive fronts farther west. Internal analyses compiled lessons on timing, relief thrusts against outer rings reinforced by anti-tank belts, and on the need to stockpile fuel for one-time surges. Soviet statements stressed the coordination between fronts, the closure and reduction of the pocket, and the capture of prisoners and equipment. Internal memoranda noted shortfalls in timely mine reseeding at certain sectors, and called for additional training in night defense against mass crossings. In the immediate aftermath, both commands addressed discipline and morale. German units that had broken out were granted short rest where possible, then reinserted into defensive positions. Award recommendations noted actions during river crossings and rearguard fights, but were tempered by the need to preserve cohesion. Soviet formations rotated battalions off the line for refit, processed awards for units credited with seizing key villages and repelling relief thrusts, and initiated political education cycles that framed the encirclement as confirmation of operational doctrine, rather than as a singular event. Strategic consequences extended beyond the maps of February. The attrition of the encircled corps and the failure to re-establish a stable line east of the southern Bug reduced Army Group South's capacity to resist subsequent operations in March-April 1944. For the Red Army, the clearing of the Cherkasy sector shortened the front and unlocked forces for the Uman-Botoshany directions, pushing the fighting toward the approaches to Romania. The withdrawal and reconstitution cycle on the German side could not keep pace with Soviet operational tempo, sustained by repaired rails and shorter road hauls across newly secured districts. By late February, the Korsun-Shevchenkovsky operation had transitioned fully into post-combat administration and preparation for the next phase. The battle's immediate aftermath, surrendered groups processed, survivors reorganized, villages cleared and recorded, lines stabilized, captured the concrete results of a month-long sequence that began with converging pincers and ended with a contested river crossing under winter weather. The final measures of success and loss were not expressions of sentiment, but ledgers of personnel, equipment, ground gained, and time. Entries that would frame the concluding assessments of the operation's place in the wider campaign across right bank Ukraine. The operation's legacy rests on how decisions taken between late January and 17th February intersected with constraints of terrain, logistics, and command doctrine. German post-war analyses stressed the tension between the imperative to hold forward lines and the operational vulnerability of a salient whose shoulders were already under pressure. Orders issued before the 16th of February directed the 11th and the 32nd Army Corps to maintain the perimeter while relief assembled. Only after that date were breakout preparations authorized as a synchronized act with an external thrust. Staff officers later argued that an earlier withdrawal to a shorter line could have reduced the encirclement risk, but contemporaneous reports show that fuel stocks, rail capacity, and the need to protect remaining east-west routes weighed against retrograde movement without clear jump-off positions already secured. Soviet after-action summaries attributed the outcome to the methodical application of converging attacks, rapid creation of an inner and outer ring, and the use of anti-tank defense in depth to fracture any relief corridor before it stabilized. Quantitatively, the results can be expressed as personnel and materiel ledgers rather than general characterizations. Estimates compiled after the battle indicate that several tens of thousands of German personnel from 11th and 32nd Army Corps entered the pocket. A substantial fraction broke out in groups ranging from squads to battalions, while others were captured east of the Hnilai-Tikich, or during crossings. Later studies converge on German deaths on the order of 15,000 to 20,000 during the encirclement and breakout, with prisoners taken in the tens of thousands. Heavy equipment, artillery, most vehicles, and a large share of heavy infantry weapons was abandoned or destroyed. Soviet casualty reporting, distributed across inner ring village assaults, outer ring anti-tank engagements, and counterattacks on relief axes, likewise reached into the tens of thousands when aggregated at front level. Precise figures vary across archival series and remain the subject of specialized scholarship, comparing daily returns, hospital admissions, and post-operation audits. Operational lessons extracted on the German side address the feasibility of air supply to encircled field formations in winter conditions, transport aircraft availability, strip conditions, and cloud ceilings produce daily lifts short of consumption curves for fuel and ammunition. The conclusion, already evident after Stalingrad and reinforced here, was that air bridges could not sustain corps-sized forces engaged in continuous perimeter defense and preparing for breakout under artillery pressure. A second lesson concerned river lines under freeze-thaw. Planning assumptions about ice load-bearing limits required conservative margins, more bridging equipment forward, and earlier identification of alternate fords. Relief doctrine emphasizing narrow, deep thrusts encountered layered anti-tank belts supported by pre-planned artillery concentrations, where fuel and artillery ammunition could not be massed for a single surge. Incremental probes exhausted spearheads without generating the sustained widening required for two-way traffic. Soviet analyses codified the encirclement pattern as a replicable method. Successive directives highlighted 4 pillars: synchronized operational pincers to close a ring, immediate construction of inner and outer fronts, flexible reduction of village strong points to compress maneuver space, and anti-tank defenses in depth positioned on ridges, road bends, and river exits. Artillery was treated as the decisive integrator. Counter-battery, interdiction, and time-on-target strikes at predicted bottlenecks during relief attempts and breakouts. Rail and road repair units, introduced into the area while fighting still continued on the outer ring, were credited with accelerating the transition to subsequent operations toward Uman and the southern Bug. At the same time, internal memoranda noted shortfalls, delays reseeding mines after night engagements, gaps in night observation over river lines, and the cost of repeated assaults on fortified villages, and recommended additional training and equipment for ice reconnaissance and winter bridging. From the perspective of command relations, the battle is used to examine the interaction between theater-level intent and local execution. On the German side, Army Group South's emphasis on holding economically significant districts and railway nodes conflicted with the need to preempt encirclement by shortening fronts. Directives from higher authority constrained redeployment of mobile reserves and delayed the authorization for breakout until relief was judged imminent. On the Soviet side, Stavka's aim to destroy large enemy groupings west of the Dnieper required parallel commitments along a front hundreds of kilometers wide. Korsun-Shevchenkovsky demonstrates how front commanders balance the allocation of mobile formations between the inner reduction and the outer defense without overcommitting to either task. Both sides operated with imperfect information. Clouded air reconnaissance, radio outages, and deceptive movements complicated estimates of opposing reserves and fuel states. Civilian and administrative dimensions formed a persistent backdrop. The districts around Korsun-Shevchenkovsky had experienced fortification, requisition, and intermittent fighting since 1943. During the operation, local administrations dealt with sheltering populations in basements, rationing wells near roadheads, and post-battle sanitation and burial under winter conditions. After the pocket's reduction, commandant offices registered property for future compensation, reopened bakeries and mills where feasible, and organized mine clearance to restore civilian movement along marked lanes. German survivor accounts west of the river describe the reconstitution of mixed groups, immediate medical triage, and the transformation of those who escaped into improvised formations for defense along new lines as the front moved toward Uman. Strategically, the outcome accelerated the unhinging of Army Group South's positions on right bank Ukraine. The attrition of 2 corps and the loss of heavy equipment reduced the capacity to hold the next river lines. Formations that survived emerged with diminished mobility and firepower. For the Red Army, the operation shortened the front in the Cherkasy sector and freed rifle and tank armies for the Uman-Botoshani direction, contributing to advances that, in March-April 1944, pressed toward the Carpathians and the approaches to Romania. The longer-term effect lay in confirming that, given salient geometry, winter road nets, and an adequate density of reserves, encirclement could be executed at the operational scale with predictable requirements for artillery, engineers, and logistics. Historiography has focused on several debates: whether an earlier German withdrawal could have prevented the pocket, how much the weather and river conditions, rather than planning errors, determined the crossing outcomes, and how to reconcile divergent casualty totals across archives. Studies of orders issued up to the 16th of February indicate that the decision to forbid withdrawal reflected a preference to trade risk in one sector to buy time elsewhere for the larger defensive system. Critics argue that the cost at Korsun outweighed those gains. Analyses of Soviet planning emphasized that the outer ring's depth and artillery density, not only meteorology, limited the relief force's ability to hold a corridor. Archival reconciliations continue to refine numbers by cross-referencing daily returns with hospital and prisoner rolls. In military education, Korsun Shevchenkovsky functions as a case study in winter operations, with encirclement and relief under contested air and constrained supply. It illustrates the interplay between operational intent and logistics, the decisive influence of rivers under freeze-thaw, and the necessity of aligning authorization for breakout with verified relief conditions, rather than schedules alone. It also highlights the administrative burdens, POW processing, civilian stabilization, infrastructure repair, that begin before combat ends and shape the tempo of subsequent operations. The operations place in the Dnieper-Carpathian campaign is therefore defined not by single episodes, but by cumulative effects. Forces fixed and reduced, equipment left behind, transportation networks restored or denied, and timelines advanced or delayed. By the end of February 1944, the front in central Ukraine had moved westward. The Korsun pocket had been eliminated. Survivors were redistributed. Units on both sides incorporated lessons into orders and training. Maps record the geographical change, but the operational record shows a more granular transformation. Doctrinal adjustments, supply practices rewritten, and command procedures recalibrated for the next engagements. In that sense, the operation's significance lies in how it compressed multiple factors, planning, weather, terrain, and logistics, into a sequence whose outcomes influence the remainder of the winter campaign and the approach to the southern borders of the Axis alliance.